My name is Amy Laura Hall, and I am going to be giving a series of short lectures that are specifically for people who are training for United Methodist ministry through the licensing program of my conference, my home conference, the Rio Texas Conference. So if you are viewing and listening and you are not part of that particular constituency, please know that these short lectures are specifically for that constituency, and I can answer questions about that program for people outside that program later. But for now, I'm going to be presenting specifically for students in the licensing program for local ministry in the Rio Texas Conference, which is my home conference of the United Methodist Church. So here we go. I am going to try to teach about ethics, which is the assigned topic for this segment, in 3 parts. And you will have questions, I'm sure. I am hoping you will have lots of questions that I can answer through email. So the first thing I should explain is why I am teaching using this format rather than Zoom. So I know there are people who love to use Zoom, and I'm not going to be critical of those people. But for myself, I've found that in order to encourage a sense of trust, a genuine sense of trust, and to be able to offer genuine confidentiality, I want to present my own best words at this time for this constituency, and then to hear by email questions students in this constituency, this particular program, have through email that then I can answer through phone, just the old-fashioned, well, the newfangled phone, and through email. So that's why I am presenting ethics in this particular way. It's the best way I know of, given the way that I most prefer to teach and answer questions from individuals and groups of students in a particular class. So we are doing this thing that is my teaching and y'all learning and asking me questions at a time that I've come to call the plague of 2020. I want to say from the outset that I am not going to be answering a set of questions in these 3 short lectures. I'm not going to be addressing specifically COVID related questions. I am going to be giving suggestions and something of an analysis of church life, congregational life, not at this particular time. So while I will note that we are living through COVID, I am not going to be teaching in a way that's going to try to answer particular questions related to COVID, except for periodically through this time. Having said that, I want to note that I don't expect y'all, the people who are in this constituency, who are in this program I'm teaching, I don't expect y'all to be particularly, let me back up. There is a trend going on right now in at least teaching circles, not all teaching circles, but some, and it might also be happening in ministerial contexts. Y'all can let me know if you're hearing this, but I've come to call it the brutalist yoga version of teaching during COVID. And that is, we are to be resilient. We are to be also, at the same time that we're being resilient, we are to be nimble and agile. And another term we're hearing a lot in pedagogical teaching circles is that we're to be able to blend. And so I don't do yoga, and if I were to do yoga, I would not do brutalist yoga. I do not expect you, dear students, to be particularly nimble, agile, resilient or blended during this time. I suppose there are people in this world who are experiencing this particular pandemic as a time of resilience or agility or limber. They're becoming more limber. But that's not how most human beings in my life, not how most students or colleagues are experiencing this time. So I don't expect you to shine and show your capacity to arrange yourself in a particular way during this time. It's remarkable that we are having this conversation, and I'm grateful that you're in this program at this time and you haven't dropped out. So, okay, so there's another temptation right now going on that I will go ahead and say at the outset, and that is this brutalist yoga trend goes along with, often in institutions, with a kind of sense of competition and scarcity. So if you are in a district, a conference, an annual conference, and you happen to be listening in, or you're in any kind of institutional setting where you are being told to be particularly nimble, agile, blended, whatever, also receiving a message that you might lose your job if you do not perform all of this agility well, just know that there are other people who are experiencing that, and try as best you can with your colleagues to name that and to resist it, to find ways to be in solidarity with one another, in truthful, giving truthful perspectives about what you're going through. It's really important to have colleagues, peers, friends at this time. Make a phone call, talk to a friend, talk honestly about what you're dealing with in your ministry, and as much as you can, resist that sometimes tacit, sometimes explicit call to be in competition with one another for who can do the best Zoom ministry, for example. Okay. And on that, I will tell you that at a certain point, late March, I believe it was, I'm trying to remember, a journalist named Bob Garfield, who is a very experienced, seasoned, wise journalist. You might not agree with him, but no one would say he's not a seasoned journalist, with WNYC Radio, said on his podcast, he does a podcast called On the Media with Brooke Gladstone, and on the actual podcast, he talked about how he had spent a lot of time crying, actually crying real tears. And there was also a CNN reporter who, not long ago, a grown man journalist who wrote words about how he had woken up or had gone through his day planning on doing his daily work in journalism, and found himself just needing to spend time, or he just did, whether he needed to or not. He didn't think, oh, I will consciously now decide to cry for a while. But he wrote about this. It was something like, if you looked up on CNN, it is okay to not be okay. Something like that. Sorry, I don't remember his name. So it is okay not to be okay right now. And if you're feeling like you're an outlier in not being okay right now, just know that Bob Garfield and this other CNN reporter, who I can't remember his name, you're in good company. If you needed to know that, you're in good company. So here is how ethics usually, many times, functions. I'm going to give you a series of how I don't teach ethics. There's a show called What Not to Wear. I think that's the name of it, something like that. And I often think of this as my, what not to wear, how not to teach ethics, or at least how I don't teach ethics. And I've got good reason for not teaching ethics this way. I've been teaching ethics now, gosh, if you count my time at Yale when I was a graduate student, also teaching while I was a PhD student, I've been teaching ethics now for about 25 years. Yeah, about 25 years. I've been teaching at Duke for 21 years on faculty here at Duke University after I graduated from Yale with my PhD. I also did my Master's of Divinity at Yale Divinity School, in case anybody's interested. So here's the way that ethics usually functions as a conversation. So one is ethics as what to do if you are the decider in some sort of scenario where you will decide who lives and who dies. So the show, what's it called? The Good Place? I think it's called The Good Place. The show The Good Place recently, the whole show is supposed to be about ethics, but one of the episodes they had was on the trolley problem. And it's basically, you've got 2 people are going to die over here, 15 people are, the trolley problem is presented in different ways depending. But it's basically, you're the person driving a machine that is going to kill people, and you have to decide, are you going to kill this amount of people or this amount of people? Another scenario that's often used in ethics conversations is a lifeboat where you have to decide who's going to eat whom and who's going to be thrown to the sharks, as if that's basically what ministers do. But this kind of bizarro case study way of teaching ethics is very common, and it often goes along with a way of teaching ethics that where you are sitting there as an individual being told, here is the scenario where you have to decide who's going to live and who's going to die. It's an ethics of scarcity where, that's my air conditioner, hopefully you can still hear me. An ethics of scarcity so that it's not the case that everyone can live. It's that somebody has to get thrown to the sharks or run over by the trolley. So it goes, these scenarios are set within a context of scarcity where you, the individual, have to make the decision because you're the decider. And then if you're in a class on ethics where the teacher is teaching this way, you then will often be given a scrap or a whole text written by almost always a Western European man who has written a tome or a set of texts on ethics, and then the instructor will explain to you that your way of reasoning about who to kill with the trolley fits within a particular form of Western European philosophy, and then you will know, oh, I think like John Stuart Mill, or I think like Bentham, and it is totally okay if you don't know these names. You don't need to look them up, not for the purposes of this class. But often if you have taken an ethics class where you were trained in that way, where you were given a scenario where you had to decide who lives and who dies, and where it's not possible for everyone to live, and then your instructor gave you the name of someone who could validate your attempt at answering this scenario that you won't experience most of the time in the ministry unless you are in boating. I don't know. If you've experienced that, that's one way of teaching ethics. That's not how I teach ethics, and probably by my facial expressions, you've already gotten some sense of why I think this is a bizarre way of teaching ethics, especially to people who are going to actually be working with real people in the real world, where you're not going to be deciding about who lives and who dies. There are reasons historically why this method of teaching ethics became a thing, and I can explain that in another lecture. You don't have to know that for the purposes of this class. Okay. Other ways of teaching ethics, I'm just checking my time watch because I have gone over at times, and then I can't download the videos on YouTube or because they're too long. We'll see if I can do that this time. Keep to my time limit. Other ways of teaching ethics, and these to some extent do involve practical wisdom, but these ways of teaching ethics I do not think are ultimately as helpful as other ways. And so another way of teaching ethics that is not the way I teach is ethics primarily as a matter of personal temptation. So you probably have experienced something like this in your own life, working before you went into the licensing program, through a different line of work, or even in your ministry you may have experienced something like you've got a very clear I should say no to this situation, like someone saying I will give you this amount of money for this project if you will do something that you know is not actually going to be for the good of your congregation. These are obvious. This is part of the plot of many different situational comedies. It's like somebody deciding, am I going to do the right thing? So it's these momentary, sporadic, and obvious, you should say no. So ethics as personal temptation. And in my experience, those do happen. Those occasions do happen. But you have to have you have to go way upstream in terms of individual formation and having a team of friends, of colleagues, such that you will have the wherewithal to say no when you are faced with an obvious situation. So I don't find that here you're going to be faced with this individual situation. What are you going to do? It's usually pretty obvious what you should do. Question is, how do you be in such a context where you have colleagues, you have friends, you're in a situation of solidarity, you're not individually facing this situation, but that you will have a whole team of people who will help you when you are facing a really difficult decision in your ministry. So I don't find the individual temptation version of ethics to be terribly helpful because it gives you this one little snapshot of time, and the bigger picture is really important. And so thinking about the bigger picture is part of what I'm going to try to give you a little bit of in the third of these short little lectures. Okay. Also, the short, very short, you can, I promise, read it in about 15 minutes essay that I signed for this is called Ethics Can't Be a Side Hustle. And I'll make sure I connect that each time I post this video on Facebook, especially, I don't know if I can post it on YouTube. But anyway, ethics can't be a side hustle. So there is another way of doing ethics where ethics is about what you do to buy offsets for what you're doing wrong in your vocation. So these essays are written by they're written by a man named Mike Montiero. He's writing them specifically for students who are in tech design. And I find his essays to be very helpful in terms of practical wisdom for people within a particular vocation. So you may think, well, why would she assign this essay? I'm not doing tech design. The form of what he's saying to people in the tech industry, the form of his questions and answers, I think, are very applicable for people working within any institution where you're working with people and you're having to think through how the system that you're working within may be putting you into a context that is itself unethical, so that you are in a system of unethics, a system of amorality or immorality. So Ethics can't be a side hustle. Ethics cannot be something that you do as a kind of gig or a hobby. And often ethics is taught this way, so ethics is something about volunteering in your free time. Ethics is something you do in your free time. So at your job, you do your job and you hold your nose if it's a really bad situation where you know that you are part of a system that is hurting people. Not literally as in the trolley running over people, although sometimes in certain industries that's exactly what people are doing, not the trolley, but hurting people physically. So ethics can't be something that you do in your time off from your job. Ethics can't be a side hustle, is something that I really think will be useful as you're thinking about ethics in the ministry. So not in tech design, but in the ministry as you're thinking about the system within which you're working. Okay, then there's also ethics as Ms. Manners or Ask the Ethicist. So there's ethics as, here is a situation where I don't want to be rude, but I also want to be transparent, or I don't want to be crossing boundaries, but I also want to be loving. It's some sort of kind of the same sort of thing as the personal ethics plus conundrum, and then you get basically how to have good manners. So the kind of civil society version of ethics. How do I remain a person of good standing in my neighborhood? How do I do what's most appropriate and don't seem rude? Good advice, possibly, if you've got people who can help you and you're having trouble not being rude, not wanting to encourage you to be rude, but I don't find those conversations about ethics to be terribly informative, because I just don't know that that's ethics. That's Ms. Manners, and I don't teach manners. That's not what I do. Although I'll tell you to stand up straight or whatever it is you don't need to hear from me about manners. I don't find that form of ethics to be terribly instructive, because usually it's common sense, or ask a friend you trust about what to wear and what occasion. That's just, I'm not interested in telling you what to wear. Okay, at this point I am going to, I'm gonna pause, because otherwise, so this was part 1, and I'm going to go into part 2 and 3 next. All right, let's stop this first installment, second installment to come.